The Irish Mail was a passenger train that ran between London's Euston via the West Coast Main Line towards Holyhead via the North Wales Main Line and would operate between 1848 and 2002, being known as one of the first ever named trains of the United Kingdom. The service had commenced around the 1st of August, 1848. However, due to the construction of the Britannia Bridge at the time, the service would have to be terminated at Bangor before the bridge was finally completed and was soon extended to Holyhead once the line was finally completed. For most of its life until 1923, it had operated under the hands of the London and North Western Railway, which used a variety of rolling stock, including their most iconic locomotive to ever be manufactured at the workshops at Crewe, that being the Claughton class of 10-wheelers that were used on the Irish Mail services even into the formation of the LMS.
Other rolling stock used by the LNWR include the Greater Britain class, a fleet of 2222 type steam locomotives, and the Alfred the Great class of 440 four-coupled American type steam locomotives, which were also used on the Irish Mail service. When the LMS took over the service in 1923, they would continue to use the LNWR fleet until the introduction of the Royal Scot class in 1927, and other classes that were also introduced by the LMS to pull the Irish Mail, with even a few Claughtons being rebuilt to operate the service as well. Although the Irish Mail was discontinued during the First and Second World Wars and had major accidents during its history, the service would be passed on into British Railways in 1948, in which most of the LMS rolling stock would continue to be intact even after the introduction of the BR Standard classes to be used on this service. And during that time, the Royal Scot classes were rebuilt to reflect on these operations during the 1950s and 60s, as the rebuilt Royal Scot classes would be used on the express services as well as the Irish Mail services that it had since the 1920s. However, after the introduction of the electrification along the West Coast Main Line and diesel locomotives to replace steam, the Irish Mail would be taken over by a fleet of diesel and the electric type locomotives, as the last of the few steam locomotives were not withdrawn until 1968. And throughout the 1970s and 1980s, even after the introduction of the Intercity 125s with the Class 43s, the Irish Mail would continue to operate with a fleet of Class 47s and Class 86s and 87s to operate the Irish Mail until the 1990s, when the Intercity 125s began to take over the service between London's Euston and Holyhead, with the Class 47s and 86s and 87s being replaced by the Intercity 125s. When British Railways began to be privatized in the 1990s, the Irish Mail was now under the hands of Virgin Trains, as during the 1980s, it was a part of the Intercity service, a sector of the British Railway system, and Virgin Trains would operate the Irish Mail, even celebrating its 100th anniversary in service. But this wouldn't even last long, as eventually, due to a policy of discontinuing the named trains that they had in service, the Irish Mail would operate for the last time around 2002, officially being discontinued and being replaced with an unnamed service between London's Euston and Holyhead, which is now operated by Advanti West Coast and now uses a fleet of Class 805 bi-mode diesel-electric multiple units, as they now operate the service between London's Euston and Holyhead. The legacy of the Irish Mail cannot be understated, as this service was one of the first ever to have a named service operated by a railway company in Great Britain, as it soon created a domino effect of named trains that would operate across Great Britain, and would soon led into the creation of many of the famous named trains, like the Flying Scotsman, the Royal Scot, and the Cornish Riviera Express, with the legacy of the Irish Mail not being forgotten, as the legacy of the Irish Mail would remain as one of the first ever named trains in Great Britain and one of the most well-known of these named trains to ever be operated by a well-known company, and one of the more famous ones to ever be operated under the hands of the London Midland and Scottish Railway Company of Great Britain.